As I say, you asked me for another topic. We talked last time up to about the rising, and there were a lot of questions around that from people relating to the present day. I mean, inevitably, we're in a decade of centenaries, and we're looking back 100 years, which isn't very long in human terms. I mean, we all knew people.
S.A.H I.
Yeah, we all knew people who were actually alive and well in 1912 and 1916 and during the Great War. I mean, I grew up quite near a Somme veteran, you know, my father used to shave him actually as a very old man, and you know, apart from knowing he fought in that Somme and had medals, I never thought of asking him, you know, what was it like. And then suddenly the series came on television, The Great War. I knew people who remembered being in Dublin during the Rising. I knew one of them very well, who lived to be 100 and only died 4 years ago, Jimmy Kelly, the reporter, and told me about the still smouldering mounds. As a small boy, he was brought by his policeman father down Sackville Street. So it's not that long ago, really, you know. And if you consider the changes we have seen since the Second World War, I mean, all the advantages that have flowed from the British welfare state, which washed over this region in the late 1940s. I mean, my mother was born in 1923 and she's 92, and she grew up in that grinding poverty, and she lost her own mother to TB when she was a year and a half. And so when my mother contemplates the hungry 20s and the hungry 30s and the war years, and then suddenly, by the middle of the 1950s, you know, free specs, false teeth, cod liver oil, not so good, you know, conch orange juice, free education, family allowances, the pension to the grave. Harold Macmillan was right when he told people in the late 50s, you've never had it so good. And at that time we had industry here. Okay, declining, shipbuilding, engineering, linen was nearly gone. But you still had industry in the sense that that was going to continue forever. So we have to remember, we're not talking about the dark ages when we talk about 1916 to 1922, which shaped this island, north and south. We're talking about events that our grandparents were alive and well to as they occurred at that particular time. And we talked last time about the 1916 Rising, and it's worth just having a sense of the causes of the Rising, because you sometimes call the 1916 Rising the bolt from the blue. Now, at the time, there were very polarized views on it. Basil Brooke, who became Prime Minister here for 20 years, said he was in the trenches in northern France when the Rising occurred. He never called himself an Irishman from that day. But then there were Irishmen of both traditions. But let's look at the nationalists for a minute in the trenches in northern France, who were at the Dardanelles, and they also felt the Rising was a stab in the back. You know, there's a letter in the Irish News in 1918, at the very end of the war, from 10 volunteers of the Old Brigade being demobbed from the Western Front. Joe Devlin's army, who had joined the Connaught Rangers, and they write, there are no supporters of De Valera here. We're all Redmondites here. This was 2 years after 1916. So you have different attitudes to the Rising. But the main one was, of course, that Irish nationalists very quickly, having supported Redmond in Home Rule and the war, within months certainly within 6 months, their attitudes were totally transformed by the executions of 1916. They didn't support the Rising, the 500 civilians who died, the destruction of the second city in the British Empire, something else our grandparents would have told us. We've been here 100 years ago. Your local churches, which were filled, would have been organising Easter weekends, special trains to Dublin, because Dublin was the metropolis. You just have to read all the Belfast papers. People were, it says sort of Good Friday, Easter Saturday, 1916. People are in training, there's a word, E-N-T-R-A-I-N-I-N-G, in training, getting the train to the metropolis, the city. Because people will have, even yet when you go to Dublin, you see an imperial city with all that beautiful architecture. And you see all the old crowns and harps from British Empire days. And you know you're in a capital city. It was designed as the capital of Ireland, a very British city. So loads of people from the Shankill, the Falls and the Malone Road were heading to Dublin. The more affluent to the races at Ferryhouse. The ordinary people to their Sunday school excursions. There was a teachers' conference in Dublin that weekend, with people of all traditions going to that. There were clergymen going to see relatives in the south from all the Protestant churches and Catholic and the Roman Catholic Church. You had all of that going on. And they didn't expect a rising. And the man who didn't expect a rising above all was a 35-year-old man from East Belfast. I've mentioned him before. His name was Jim Mitchell. He was from 121 The Mount. Quite a nice address even today, The Mount. His father was an ironmonger in Harland and Wolff, now an old man. As a family, they had signed the covenant in Westbourne Presbyterian Church in 1912. So they were unionists. He had a decent job. He was a lecturer in maths in Belfast Tech. But from the start of the war, he wanted to join the army. 35 was old 2 years into the war. They wanted young men, nimble young men for the Western Front. 35, people died at 50, you know. You were getting on a bit. I'm sorry for you 35-year-olds in the audience. There you are. So he decided he would take the direct route, James Mitchell, from the Mount. He would drive to Dublin with some friends. Nice car, leather seats, his brother, some friends, two friends, all about the same age, school friends. They were going to Dublin. They were going to go to Royal Barracks on the Liffey, beside the Four Courts. Because Dublin was studded with barracks. You had Arbour Hill Barracks, you had Royal Barracks, you had Beggar Bush Barracks. It was a big military centre. And they were going to walk in and just go up to the recruiting sergeant and say, look, we want to join the army. We're fed up messing about, being told to wait. We want to join the army. So they drove down on that summer Good Friday, unseasonably nice weather. Easter was late. They met lots of traffic, if you could call, 5 cars every hour, lots of traffic on that rocky road to Dublin. As the glitterati were going down to stay in the Gresham and the Shelburne, all the linen lords, all the shipbuilders, all the lawyers, all heading down to Dublin, to the capital of Ireland. British government, Union Jacks, all the way down Sackville Street. Nobody had to prove anything. It was a British capital. And the officer on duty, what would you call him, the recruiting officer, gave them the king's shilling. Remember that old routine? You were given a shilling and it says, the king's head on it then, and you join the army. And instead of saying, okay, your billets are here, you're going to be trained tomorrow, the recruiting sergeant said, look lads, we're all going to the races. This is a lovely weekend. We're doing nothing till about next Wednesday. Go to the races. Can't be bothered with this today. Come back in the middle of next week and we'll arrange for you to go to France. No problem. He probably added, you'll be dead time enough. So they went off into the sort of unseasonably warm sunshine of spring Dublin. They booked into the Gresham Hotel. It was the second best hotel in Dublin then, but it almost faced the GPO. Here's the Gresham, we're looking over there at the GPO. What is that building I'm looking at, by the way? The library, okay, I knew it was something important. So they're looking at the GPO. It wasn't in 1916. It had just been reopened after some alterations. Yeah, it was a fine enough building, Georgian building, and the architect was from Armagh. And it was busy on Easter Monday. They were selling stamps. But anyway, booked into the Gresham Hotel, and on Easter Monday the hotel was full of Northerners, You get this in Dublin a lot, rugby matches. Full of Northerners. Everybody talking about what they were going to do. I'm borrowing your idea. Where are you going? Oh, I'm going to Swift Pub. All right, I'm going there too, Everybody is talking. Easter Monday, my friend James Mitchell and his friends go to the races at Ferryhouse for a bit of a flutter. That's where you go, 10 miles outside Dublin. You can still go there. I have a friend, he's actually from the Shankill, who was a security man in Stranmillis, and he always asked me places in Ireland. He said, where's that, Eamon? I'll say, it's near Clonmel. He says, that's great. I only know Ireland by the race courses. Because he's been to them all, He doesn't know the big cities, he knows Clonmel, He knows all the Ferryhouse. Anyway, they went to the races. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a rumour spreads. There's a rising in Dublin. Now, there hadn't been a rising since 1867. There was one before that in 1798. A rising. Are you serious? The city we left a couple of hours ago in splendid sunshine, with ladies with their bonnets, walking with their soldier friends up and down one side of Sackville Street. People couldn't believe this. He got the train, And the train stopped shy of the city because there was something happening. It stopped at Broadstone Station. They had to walk 3 miles into the city. It was late afternoon. What a changed scene. My goodness. Dead horses on the street. Human blood on the pavement. Men in strange green uniforms had taken over the GPO, which had been open to all comers that morning. People had looted Cleary's department store. 50 men had disappeared in bicycles who never had bicycles before that morning as they looted the shops. And the Gresham was being boarded up, so they thought, we'd better get in here. This is bad. Evening, got into the Gresham, helped to board it up with sandbags. Very excitable women in the hotel. People who had expected a lovely weekend, going to the zoo, going to Kingstown, now Dunleera, Kingstown where Queen Victoria and every monarch who had come to Ireland had arrived. Everybody went to Kingstown with this Martello Tower and its little cafes, and the 40-foot where you could have a swim. But this was different. Nobody was going anywhere. They were staying in the hotel. The chefs were sizing up the rations for the week. This wasn't going to be cuisine anymore. This was going to be survival rations. And suddenly he was in the middle of a revolution. An East Belfast loyalist who had gone down to join the army with his friends was in the middle of a revolution. Very soon he missed Pearse reading the proclamation. Patrick Pearse, the son of an Englishman, the son of an English sculptor, monumental sculptor, of radical politics, who had come to Ireland to ply his trade, mainly making statues for churches, and had started a company in Brunswick Street. There's a good name, Great Brunswick Street in Dublin, now called Pearse Street, by the way. Married an Irish girl. James Pearse had been a Protestant when he came to Ireland. He may have converted with his wife, that's not clear, but he was an Englishman. He had no Irish connections at all. His son becomes Patrick Pearse, the Commander-in-Chief of the garrison of the GPO, the man who becomes effectively the first president of the Irish Republic that he declared. In the GPO with Pearse, probably glimpsed by our friend Mitchell from the top, where he stayed along the time, the top of the Gresham Hotel, as Dublin was embattled. Beside him was a man who had an address in Belfast, Glenalina Terrace on the Falls Road, directly opposite the gates of the city cemetery. His name was James Connolly, known as Jim to his friends. He had looked a bit like the late David Irvine. I think David Irvine cultivated the image of it. That bushy moustache, the bald head, you know, the kind of thick set, you know, that was James Connolly, with a very distinctive, and I say this with all respect to the Reverend clergyman, a very distinct Scottish burr as he spoke. Because Connolly had come up the hard way, grinding poverty in Edinburgh, of Irish parents from the north of Ireland. Everybody called it the north of Ireland, by the way. Ulster doesn't come into later on, the north of Ireland. Joined the British Army after a career as a scavenger, street cleaner, but read voraciously, read socialism and read Irish history. Came to Ireland in the uniform of a British soldier. And that was his first real stable job. Left, married an Irish girl, got involved in trade unionism, socialism, went to America, set up one of the biggest unions in America, called the Wobblies. Came back to Ireland, went north. There was a sort of a ferment. People wanted to join unions for the first time, especially unskilled workers who were treated like trash by the business class. Connolly had offices in York Street, and he worked for about 3 years, addressing crowds at Customs House steps, addressing crowds at Upper Library Street. And he faced all sorts of problems, particularly the hostility of the business leaders led by Thomas Gallagher, the tobacco magnate. Gallagher, who'd set up his tobacco factory in York Street in the 1860s, coming from Derry, Londonderry, where he had a small plant. He didn't want unions at all. Keep the wages low, make big profits. People are lucky to have jobs. And anyway, we give them free cigarettes. What else could you want for a long and satisfying life? Anyway, so Gallagher was Connolly's dyed in the wool anyway. He didn't want unions at all. So Connolly had been living in Belfast, forging links with trade unionists across the board. For example, Jack Beattie, a future Labour MP from East Belfast, MP for Pottinger, then he won West Belfast on a cross-community vote during the war. Jack Beattie was one of Connolly's men. Harry Midgley from the Old Park Road, who fought in the First War, wrote beautiful poems from the trenches about the men who were shot at dawn. Harry Midgley was one of Connolly's supporters. This was pre-partition Ireland. It wasn't a sectarian thing. It was the struggle for life. But Connolly ended up in the Rising. How could he have been there that day when our friend was in the Gresham Hotel? Very simply, Connolly had preached, workers of the world unite. Forget about religion and nationality. He believed in international socialism. It would catch the imagination of ordinary people. They would have a good wage, a good house, a pension. That's what he was arguing for in an age when that didn't really exist. Well, what disillusioned Connolly was the outbreak of the war. In his socialist view, influenced by Karl Marx, the workers from Germany, Britain, Austria, Ireland, had followed the kings and the Kaisers to the battlefields of Europe, regardless of all this fraternal solidarity that Connolly and others had been preaching right across Europe. So he lost faith in international socialism. He began to think the only hope is a socialist republic in Ireland, orange and green. And he was planning with a small citizen army a workers' revolution in 1916. Everybody wanted it during the war, when the British government would be deflected to the battlefields of Europe. But Connolly found, of course, he only had 200 men in the Irish Citizen Army, formed during the Dublin labour troubles of 1913, founded by an Ulsterman, Captain Jack White from Brashead, the son of Field Marshal Sir George White. Jack White set up the Irish Citizen Army. Connolly was going to have his own revolution. Of course, another revolution was being planned that he didn't know about, the IRB, the secret society going back to post-famine times. Founded in America and Ireland at the same time. A lot of anti-British feeling there, blaming Britain for the famine, a million dead. The Fenian, they called themselves, because the word Fenian comes from the word Féna. I know it's a term of abuse in Belfast, but the word Féna meant soldiers, Finn McCool and Féna. So the IRB called themselves the Fenians and the Féna. They were planning a rising when England's difficulty would be Ireland's opportunity. They were led by a number of people, but the oldest there was a man called Tom Clark. We call him Old Tom Clark, and you can guess why. He was 58, so he's known as Old Tom Clark. Thank God I'm on the right side of that. So anyway, Old Tom Clark had spent 25 years in English dungeons for taking part in the Fenian dynamite campaign in London in the 1880s. But he'd been brought up in Dungannon, and again, the kind of contradictions of Irish history. His father was not only a Protestant, but a British soldier who had come to Dungannon as part of the British Army. And that's where Tom Clark was brought up. This is only Dungannon connection. His father was posted there. He becomes the spiritual inspiration of 1916. Pearse, the schoolmaster, who wanted to revive the Irish language. And others, poets, intellectuals, Connolly, the socialist. Why was Connolly there? Because just before the Rising, a couple of months before it, in January 1916, the IRB got wind that this socialist was planning to go it alone, wrecking their plans. If he goes it alone with 200 men, he'd be crushed, but the place will be flooded by British troops and we won't have our rising. So he was taken aside and told, listen, mate, you know, you're only very small beer. If you want a rising, you join us. You want something else, you go ahead. Connolly agreed to join the IRB. He would commit his tiny force to the rising. But he told his men, keep your powder dry. That sounds a bit like Ed Hazey, doesn't it? Years ago. Keep your powder dry, because when this rising's over, we might need another revolution to set up the Socialist Republic in Ireland. He's still living in Belfast, travelling up and down in the train. Contacts in the Shankill and the Falls, the Harry Midgleys and the Jack Beattys, and the Jim Larkins, and now the Patrick Pearses. Those are the people who kind of envisage the rising. So they're drawing on this old tradition of Irish separatism, republicanism, of course, founded by the Presbyterians of Belfast in the 1790s, the United Irishmen.
Not only did the Presbyterians invent republicanism, borrowing from France and America, the Presbyterians invented the Irish harp, the Harp Festival of 1792, now the symbol of the Republic of Ireland, and they saved the harp music of ancient Ireland. We're never done thanking the Presbyterians. Absolutely. But anyway, we're back in Dublin in 1916. That's what our friend sees from the GPO, the outworking of all of that. And there's men there who didn't know what was happening that day. They were told to mobilize, as they had for the previous 2 years. You know, counter-marching, mock battles, nothing serious, home for your dinner. This time they weren't home for their dinner. This time they were told, meet at Liberty Hall, Connolly's HQ, and take your orders from your officers. Some went to the GPO, some to Stephen's Green, some to Boland's Mills. All of these strong points, which were meant to prevent the British Army, if you like, surrounding them. But they were going to wait until they were attacked. One of them told a friend, we'll hold Dublin for a week and save Ireland. He was a man born John McDermott on the Fermanagh-Leitrim border. A small farm in bad land, the west of Ireland is all bad land. Went to Glasgow as a tram driver. Then came to Belfast with his skills. Drove the Shankill Road tram until 1907. Sean McDermott, as he called himself. In Belfast, he was recruited into the IRB by a number of Protestants. Ernest Blythe from Lisburn, John Ernest Lester from Carrickfergus, Bulmer Hobson from Magdala-Street. I always say he's a Protestant Republican, but he has an excuse. He's from the Holy Land. So, all of these, you might say, Ulster Prods have got involved in the Gaelic League, the IRB. They're not representative. They're a small group of journalists, thinkers, and they're looking back to 1798, the last big Presbyterian rising. McDermott becomes a leader in the GPO. He'll be executed in 1916, trained in Belfast. So many of these men are born and trained in Ulster. Sean McDermott, Tom Clark, James Connolly. We can't take Ulster out of the rising. And there's another fact. There was a house on the Antrim Road, just past what used to be the Shaftesbury Inn. The Cave Hill at its back and the lock at its front. A big villa, double-fronted villa. And it was actually occupied by this man, F.J. Biggar, Francis Joseph Biggar. F.J. Biggar was from Mollusk. There's a Biggar's town there. They were Scottish planters. They were there 300 years. They fought in the Battle of Antrim in 1798. And although a Protestant and a very wealthy man, he believed in reviving the Irish language. He spoke Irish, but he also believed in an independent Ireland. He wrote biographies of Henry Joy McCracken and Wolfe Tone. His house was a mecca for people who were interested in a different kind of Ireland. Many of them were Protestants. Alice Milligan, a poetess, a Methodist. Her brother became the Unionist mayor of Bangor in the 1960s, Samuel Milligan. He put the tombstone on her grave when she died at 96 in Omagh. It says, Alice Milligan, she loved no land but Ireland. You had these Protestant kind of, Protestants with a nationalist outlook, very important in this whole thing. Now they were a minority. Belfast was a big industrial city, well into the British Empire. The workers of the Shankill and East Belfast owed their livelihood, owed their standard of living, which was quite high in many cases, if they were skilled, to membership of the Empire. They didn't want to see Ireland dissolving its links with Britain. That would be nonsense. Anyway, they feared they would be discriminated against in a Roman Catholic theocracy. Nobody had convinced them they wouldn't. These secret Republicans didn't have much support. Yes, they were saying, you know, we cherish all the children equally, as it says in the proclamation. The Home Rule Party were linked to the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And they had a Catholic agenda, just as the Unionist Party were linked to the Orange Order. They had a Protestant agenda. So those divisions were here. With this small group of intellectuals, somebody like Ernest Blythe from Lisburn, born into an Orange farming family, ends up as Deputy Prime Minister of the Irish Free State with a new name, Arnon de Blythe, and writes his autobiography in Irish, The Man from Mahar. Everything isn't black and white. So the rising is planned in the middle of the war. It's not going to be a military victory. It would have been if they had managed to get the whole of Ireland in revolt. If Tyrone, nationalist Tyrone, had been in revolt, as well as rebel Cork and Galway and Dublin. That was the plan. There were 12,000 Irish volunteers who supported the IRB. They hadn't gone to the Western Front. They had opposed Redmond. They had kept their arms. They were going to defend Ireland's interests. And they were the men that the IRB manipulated, who marched into the GPO in 1916. But the commanding officer of the Irish Volunteers was a Northerner. John McNeill, he was born, Owen McNeill, went to St Malachy's College from the Glens of Antrim. He believed in the just war theory. He didn't believe in a suicide mission. You had to have a reasonable chance of success, and you had to have a just cause for revolution. He tried to stop the rising at the last minute. He sent messengers north, south, east and west saying, mobilization is cancelled. Then there was Sir Roger Casement, born into a big house Protestant family, born in Ballymena, really. Well, born in Dublin, but brought up in Ballymena. His father was buried in the local Protestant graveyard. Colonel Roger Casement. You know, you're walking through Ballymena graveyard, oh, suddenly you see Colonel Roger Casement and you kind of stop. It rings a bell. Then you realise the Casements were from Ballymena. There's a Casement Street in Ballymena called after his ancestors. And they had that big castle Prince Charles visits, Maharan Temple House outside Ballycastle, where he was reared when his parents lived. Diplomat, exposed the abuse of native peoples in Africa and South America, knighted by the king, but from an early age, silently moving towards nationalism, home rule, and then an independence. He goes on an arms mission to Germany, using all his diplomatic skills. He's captured. The guns are scuttled. The rising looks doomed. McNeill tries to stop it. That means that the rising is now centred on Dublin. Meanwhile, our friend James Mitchell is standing in the GPO, waiting for Crown forces to react, and they are reacting. You can just about see, looking up Sackville Street, as they called it then, Trinity College, Dublin, an exclusively Protestant institution since 1592. No Presbyterians went there until the end of the 18th century because they were excluded. It was totally Anglican, Church of Ireland. Wolfe Tone went there, Edward Carson went there. And now there were men on the roof because it had an officers' training corps. And they had guns, 300 rifles, and every British soldier who was in Dublin on leave from France was sent to Trinity. It became the government headquarters. And they were sniping on rebel positions, sniping down O'Connell's. This is how good they were. A tin can on a metal wire connected, there was a tin can was used in a metal wire between the GPO and the shops opposite to send messages across. It's a great gadget, you know. You know, don't fire till I get my tea. You know, when you sent this across, it was struck by a sniper. And when the rebels surrendered, he actually said to one of the guys at the GPO, you know, I got that. He actually said, I got your message system from the GPO. It was some shock, you know. He actually compared notes. So the rebels were really doomed from the beginning. By this stage, they knew. 1,500 men, scattered positions. They were going to be outnumbered once reinforcements arrived from the Curragh, from Belfast, and from England. And they were coming from England. Young men who had been told they were going to France. 17, 18 years of age. When they got off the boat in the early dawn of Kingstown, nothing I said at home, when they got off the boat, they used French. Bonjour, they said to the first women they met. You know, people were amazed. They thought they were in Calais. Instead, they were on the outskirts of Dublin. The rising was obviously going to be doomed. But they were going to hold Dublin for good. They were going to win public sympathy, they hoped, because they were going to be executed. The ringleaders would be executed as traitors to their country in time of war. That was the policy. Sir John Maxwell was sent over in the early days of the rising as the GOC. Do you remember that word, the GOC? You don't hear it anymore, but General Tuzo in the 1970s, the GOC. He was the GOC with full military powers, the right to court-martial and execute known traitors. After the rebels surrendered, the GPO had caught fire. James Mitchell records it all in his diary. The sort of ring of steel tightened on the GPO and the other positions. The main casualties were civilians, including about 40 children. Some of them babes and prams, caught in crossfire and ruthlessly cut down. By the end of the week, Connolly, Pearce, McDermott had to abandon the GPO. Their last stand was in a fish shop just behind it. You can still see it. On the Saturday morning, Pearce saw a whole family cut down in crossfire. He decided that the civilians had suffered enough, and he sent a messenger, a nurse, to see General Lowe in Trinity and arrange surrender. And they surrendered. He surrendered at the end of O'Connell Street there, near the Parnell Monument, to General Lowe. His son was an actor, John Loder, died about the 80s. And he recorded the whole thing. There's a photograph of the surrender. Word was sent to the other positions throughout Dublin. They handed, watching from the roof of the Gresham Hotel, James Mitchell records what he saw. All of the rebel guns were piled up on the middle of the street and decommissioned effectively outside the Gresham Hotel, which was still blockaded. And then they were marched up to waste ground at the Rotunda. That became the Garden of Remembrance later, in memory of the event. And the Queen laid a wreath there in 2011, transforming Anglo-Irish relations forever. And she actually went to the Garden of Remembrance at the top of O'Connell Street, where the 1916 men were mustered after surrender. The leaders were sent for interrogation, court-martial. 77 were sentenced to death. Of course, only 15 were executed. Some, like Countess Markievicz, were reprieved because of her gender. She was from a big house family in the west of Ireland. The first settlers coming to Ireland in the plantation were led by a man called Gore. There's a list of about 40 names, 100 names, known as Gore's List. If you want to see if your ancestors were among the first people in the plantation, you have to check Gore's List to see if your surname's there. And this Gore went slightly outside Ulster into Sligo. The family became the Gore Bulls. And Countess Markievicz was Countess Gore Bull. William Butler Yeats, the poet. Sligo was quite a Protestant town. You see, the South has changed. Sligo was about 50% Protestant when Yeats's grandfather was a rector there. And he remembered going on to Lissadell, this beautiful country house overlooking the sea. It was the Downton Abbey of County Sligo. And he wrote that lovely poem about Constance Markievicz and her sister Eva as kind of 17, 18-year-old girls. Light of evening, remember, light of evening, Lissadell, great windows open to the sun. Two girls in silk kimonos, both beautiful, one a gazelle. The gazelle was Constance Markievicz. He said she would be condemned to spend her years among the ignorant until her voice reached a high-pitched shrill. She became the Countess of the Poor, joined the IRB, joined the Citizen Army, fought in 1916, first woman elected to Westminster. And when she died, of course, in 1927, hers was a great carnival of the poor, her funeral through Dublin. She'd fed the people during the lockdown. She was a long way from her Protestant Unionist big house family in Sligo when she died in 1927. They all surrendered. She was spared. Pearce, Connolly, McDermott, MacDonagh, McBride, who was educated in Belfast, Benjamin Antrim background, they were all executed. It's the impact of the execution. Think of two things. Censorship. The executions were noted in the paper in one line. P. Pearce was executed this morning. 2 days later, J. Connolly was executed this morning. People reading their papers wondered, when's this going to stop? Is this going to go on for years, for months? Are there going to be thousands executed? Nobody knew. It was a dearth of news. It was like, one aristocratic woman wrote, it was like watching blood oozing from under a closed door. You're sitting having a cup of tea and you see this thick, matted, steaming blood coming through. It revolts you. It revolted public opinion. People who were hostile to the rising at first, they wrecked Dublin. Look at the innocent people killed. Think of the brave men fighting in France. Suddenly that begins to change. There's a new dynamic now. Sympathy is beginning to spring up. And then when the details eventually get up, James Connolly, wounded in the rising, his leg had turned to gangrene. He was in a makeshift hospital in Dublin Castle, sentenced to death. He expected it. These guys were only able to sit the night before writing their final letters. The steadiest hand ever you saw. Patrick Pearse's final letter was to a man who lived at Beaver Park in Belfast. A shipbuilder called Alec Wilson, who had sent him money for his Irish school in Dublin. Wilson was one of the partners in Harland and Wolff. And he writes, "Dear Mr. Wilson, I'm about to be executed, but my school needs money. Would you send me another £500? I mean, would you think of doing that the night before you're executed? Would you be worried about tapping money for a thing you'll never see? Don't think so. You might be thinking of that famous meal, but you'd probably be dreading the firing squad even more. So there's a bravery there, no question about it. These guys had calculated what was going to happen to them. Tom Clark, old Tom Clark, wrote to his wife, you know, things will work out well in the end. In other words, our executions are going to turn the tide against Redmondism, Home Rule, all that old nonsense about being part of the UK. Out of this will come a new vision of an Irish Republic. My Doc Rosalie, all the old romantic names for Ireland, Roisin Dhu, the poor old woman, Ireland in chains, the Shan Van Vogt, will somehow be renewed by the blood of the martyrs. It's this cult of the martyrs, this idea of a blood sacrifice. Connolly is strapped to a chair. The firing squad, young men, nervous. They've shot a lot of other people that week, but they're reluctant to shoot him. They've never shot a wounded, dying man before. Keep slipping down, and they have to stop the execution and tie him to the chair again, and then he slips again. He calls them forward and says, "Listen, I was a British soldier as myself. I had to do my duty. I only expect you to do your duty. The only thing I asked is that you don't blindfold me." And this unnerved them even more, that somebody could say this. He was eventually executed. The last to be executed. And it leaves that kind of silence. A silence that's filled by, very quickly, a cult of the dead leaders, propaganda, a new movement. You know, what are we going to call the party that these people would have led? And they fall back on an old name, Sinn Féin. We ourselves, self-reliance. If you don't like the name, you have to blame Carson's cousin, Mary Butler. She invented it. Myra de Butler. Carson's first cousin, Mary Butler, was a founder member of Sinn Féin. She was from a big house family in the west of Ireland, for Carson's mother's people were aristocrats, Cromwellian planters in County Galway. Mary Butler became a great friend of Arthur Griffith, and they were thinking of a name about 1905 for a new party. And he said something that means standing on your own feet. Something's always lost in translation. It means we ourselves, but it really means self-reliance, standing on your own feet. She invented Sinn Féin. So the name was borrowed by the men in the prisons who haven't been executed but who've been sentenced to penal servitude for life. Everybody wants to join Sinn Féin. And so a party is born out of the ashes of the GPO. And that party is given an almost military discipline, and it will win the 1918 election, the first election after the war. Now, even if you weren't radical, there was every chance of radical outcomes in 1918 because the poor had been given the vote for the first time. The electorate was multiplied by 3. Wealthy women got the vote if they were over 30. The rest wouldn't get it for another 10 years. The poor, Belfast, Dublin, Cork, Liverpool, Bristol got the vote. So there was a chance for adventure then. And they voted Sinn Féin. Why did they vote Sinn Féin? They were voting against the party they had supported for 50 years. Isaac Butt, the former Orange man, had founded the Home Rule Party, an Ulster Orange man. Parnell, a Protestant landlord, had brought it nearly to success. John Redmond, an imperialist, upper-class Catholic who wanted to stay in the British Empire, had been the leader down to the First World War. And now people were saying, we don't want that. Anyway, Britain denied us Home Rule in 1914. We want, all their promises were vain, so we are turning to Sinn Féin, an old song said. And Sinn Féin won 73 out of the 105 Irish seats. It was a landslide. Of course, in the north, in Ulster, you had a different landslide. Confident Unionist Party, proud of the deaths of its servicemen on the Western Front, who had sealed their covenant with blood. If they weren't prepared to accept home rule in Dublin, then they were never going to accept a republic. And they were now demanding exclusion from an independent Ireland. The British government, emerging from the war, was a coalition government, headed by Lloyd George, who had been a Liberal, was a Liberal, but was overwhelmingly Tory. The Liberal Party was one of the great casualties of the war. It split during the war, it split over Ireland, and Lloyd George wanted to reconstruct Britain. 1.25 million dead, including 40,000 Irishmen. Death pennies going to those houses. I had one for my grandfather. People sending them back from the slums of Liverpool and Glasgow saying, we didn't want our father to die in this war. This is no compensation for a life. They sent back that they did this. Now you would consider that very disloyal in Belfast. But in Liverpool and Bristol and Newcastle on Tyne, thousands of these were sent back by widows and families to send them back in the same covers, unopened. We don't want this. We want a better life for our children.
Yes, dear.
Big problems in Britain.
Yes, dear.
So what happens is, I said yes, dear. I felt affirmed. It was so heartening. But anyway, 1920 Act is brought in, the Partition of Ireland Act. The British government refused to consider the idea of a republic. They were going to give nationalist Ireland what they had planned in 1914, but they were going to give Ulster a separate system of home rule. There would now be two Irelands, according to the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland. The irony was, of course, that Southern Ireland included the most northerly part of Ireland, Donegal. Malin was in Southern Ireland. But of course, that hadn't been the plan. The committee that drew up the Partition Act recommended a 9-county Northern Ireland. Covenant was for 9 counties. There was a Protestant majority of about 58% in the 9 counties. So Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal would be part of Northern Ireland, with its own parliament. There would be a parliament for the 23 other counties, and they would have a link called the Council of Ireland. And they would all be over within the UK. They would still send MPs to Westminster. That's what the Government of Ireland Act said. But things had changed. The first Dáil had been formed by the Sinn Féin MPs, who called themselves now TDs, the Irish word for MP, Chapter Dáil, members of the Dáil. They declared a republic. The volunteers who had fought in 1916 and their successors became the IRA. They used a new name, the IRA. A war began between the IRA, a guerrilla war, the RIC, the mainly Catholic police, and the British Army, which would be reinforced by the Black and Tans within a year or so. The South wasn't prepared to accept a limited home rule parliament, but the North was, at least the Protestant North was. Joe Devlin, one of the few survivors of the Home Rule era, known as the member for Belfast, a working class Catholic from the Forth, who had won West Belfast in 1906. You know the story? The Devlin's, it was a tight seat. It was known as the cockpit. Do you remember the days they called West Belfast the cockpit in the 60s? You remember that was the last of that. To win it, you had to do something special. And in Devlin's case, this man, F.J. Bigger, Protestant nationalist, ran a candidate on the Shankill Road in 1906. And he was connected to the shipyard, Alec Carlyle. Alec Carlyle was a Protestant home ruler. And he ran as an independent. And he got 150 votes. And that let Joe Devlin in at West Belfast by 16 votes. And 2 Old Dáils were leaving the count. One said they were both supporters of Devlin's home rule. One says to them, Maggie, wouldn't you love to have been one of them 16 voters? She said, sure, many I was all 16. Joe Devlin is the only survivor of the leadership of the Home Rule Party. And when shipyard men went to Westminster, they always asked to see Joe Devlin. He brought them out on the terrace for tea. He talked their language. He did his best for them. He was a nationalist, but he was a labour man. He campaigned to have the Trade Boards Act applied to the linen industry, which stopped sweating and exploitation in 1910. In 1925, when Ireland was divided, he still topped the poll in West Belfast, and the Unionist Prime Minister, James Craig, told the Protestants of the Shankill and Sandy Row off for using their number one vote for Joe Devlin. When he went up the Shankill Road in his coffin, in 1934, Tommy Henderson, a house painter, independent MP for Shankill, asked could he carry Joe Devlin's coffin past Northumberland Street, because he said, when I was a boy, I threw stones at Joe Devlin's procession. And when I was a man, I was one of his closest friends in Scotland. And we worked for the same issues. He carried his coffin. And he used to say Ireland was united for one day. So there is that aspect to it as well. But 1916 changed everything. Why did we not get a 9-county Northern Ireland? Because James Craig, who was taking over from the aging Carson as leader, made a point of going to see Lloyd George in 1919. We have the record. He said, we don't want 9 counties, we couldn't control it. Too many nationalists, too many Catholics in Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. It would mean that within a few years, Northern Ireland would cease to exist with the rising nationalist population. We want 6 counties. That abandoned the Protestants of those 3 counties. 80,000 of them had signed the covenant. One minister, Presbyterian minister in Donegal, attended the final meeting of the All-Ulster Unionist Council in 1920, when the decision was finally taken to accept 6 counties. The Orange men of Cavan and Monaghan and Donegal, ministers, the landed gentry like Lord Farnham from County Cavan, they felt totally betrayed. Ronald McNeill, the historian of unionism, felt that men felt shamed and dishonoured because they were tearing up their covenant. And one Presbyterian minister, going back to his manse at Ballindrate in County Donegal, took his covenant, his personal copy, out of the frame which he had in his study. And he tore it in two and put it back in the frame. And for years that was a talking point. The broken covenant. They had been abandoned. But of course, as partition evolved, within a year there were peace talks between Sinn Féin, led by Michael Collins, and the British government. Sinn Féin wanted an all-Ireland republic. Britain refused to accept the idea of a republic. There would have to be, they said, there would have to be crown and empire. And in the end, Sinn Féin had to settle for a 26-county Irish Free State which accepted the crown and stayed within the empire. They also wanted a united Ireland. The best they got was a commission to redraw the border, a boundary commission, which in the end, faced by Craig's policy of not an inch, faced by civil war in the south on the treaty, in which 77 were executed, probably 5,000 died, the border was left alone in 1925, and the 2 Irelands emerged from that period. So what we're remembering now is really 1916. It's going to be remembered in the south as the key event in Irish independence. No question about that. Because that's what it achieved. Looking back after a century, it will be remembered as an event which the present government and all the parties will celebrate. Labour will focus on James Connolly, the man who might have made a difference had he lived. One of Connolly's friends was the Protestant former Orange man, born in Dublin as plain John Casey in the slums of Dublin. He became the playwright Sean Casey. And he had joined the Gaelic League and the Transport Union and the Citizens' Union. When Connolly was executed, Casey wrote, Irish republicanism has gained a martyr, but Irish Labour has lost a leader. As he realised that Connolly would be remembered as a patriot leader by generations to come, whereas the socialist Connolly would be forgotten. And he was more useful to socialism alive, in O'Casey's view, than dead. And that impacts on both parts of Ireland. Very weak labour movements, north and south after partition. The problem in the north was, are you for the border or are you against it? You know, what's that? You sound as though you're for it. No, I'm standing on the tightrope. That's no good. So Labour had to walk a tightrope under Harry Midgley, Jack Beattie. Sometimes it won a few seats, but mostly it failed. In the south, despite the slogan in the 1960s, the 70s would be socialist, the Labour Party failed to make a breakthrough. It got into government, but it didn't achieve that much. And that's the problem. Now it's facing possible extinction in the south because of the austerity cuts of the last 5 years. So 1916 didn't produce a utopia, but it did produce an independent Irish state. The interesting thing is that many of the people who inspired that were Protestants, and many of them were Ulstermen. That's one of the ironies of the whole thing. leader of the 1916 Rising in one of the Dublin locations, the South Dublin Union, was a man called George Irvine. He was a Protestant schoolmaster from Enniskillen. And his people had a shop in Enniskillen. They were Methodists. But he's remembered as one of the heroes of 1916. So in many ways, you know, everything is sort of confusing when we look at 1916. But it's a key event. It changes the course of Irish history. Don't be surprised, it'll be celebrated. It will be like, can we think of an event like the Covenant here being celebrated by the Unionist community as a foundation event as they see it, of Northern Ireland. You know? But it left minorities in both parts of Ireland. Because by 1922, the island was partitioned. The Northern Nationalists, 33%, are cut off from the Ireland they dreamed of. The 80,000 Loyalists, the 10% in the South, overall, of the population who were Protestant, who had opposed Home Rule because they wanted to remain British, were cut off as well. And they would decline drastically in the next 20 years. And therefore you had a nationalist population in the North that had never considered, they didn't want to be part of Northern Ireland. They were Irish. This was not a state they had fought for. They continued to look to Dublin. They become a state within a state. Yes, they're part of the state, but they're not really of it. They have their own schools, their own cultural activities, their own Irish language. I mean, what people don't realise is when it comes to the Irish language, I mean, myself included, generations of Catholics in the North every summer spent 4 weeks in Donegal, in the Gaeltacht, learning Irish. There were scholarships, everybody went. It was a great way to meet girls, because most schools were single sex. You met girls for the first time, there were ceilidhs every night. You stayed in an Irish-speaking house. The whole thing was subsidised, and you have this love affair with Donegal, that area, the Gaeltacht, from that. I mean, anybody I would know from my school days would speak Irish because they went to Donegal all those years. It's part of their kind of cultural identity, much as Orangism became a part of the cultural identity of the Unionist community. And that's kind of not really realised in a sense. That was part of being a state within a state. And it's not until the 1960s when we get TV, when we have the Black Civil Rights Movement, and when we have O'Neill, who's promising change, but maybe not delivering fast enough, that you have a new development in the nationalist community. They had used education. We talked about this before, the 47 Act, to get an education, to get to university, they formed the Civil Rights Movement. And that changes the slogan. It's now British rights for British subjects, instead of a United Ireland. You know, that is the change, you know, in that period. So in many ways, you know, 1916 leaves isolated communities, minorities on both sides. You know, and we have to realise, you know, if you were a nationalist in the North, you weren't looking for Northern Ireland. That wasn't on your railway list. You know, it's strange to go down the track. You're looking initially for Home Rule, and then you're confused because the people in the South want independence, and you hadn't really generally thought of that. You were happy enough with Home Rule. You know. Thanks very much.
Thank you.